Welcome everyone to week 6 of Counselling 265, our last week looking at narrative therapy. Today we're diving into one of the most transformative aspects of narrative therapy, reauthoring and creating alternative stories. So stories that reflect resilience, agency and cultural identity rather than those problem-saturated stories. These practices help clients reclaim authorship of their lives and help them challenge dominant deficit-based narratives and build these preferred identities that are rooted in strength, hope and cultural context. So let's get started. Reauthoring is a process of reconstructing identity through preferred narratives. So it's not just about telling a different story, it's about discovering and amplifying the stories that reflect a person's values and strengths and their hopes. So as therapists, we become collaborative witnesses, helping clients integrate those unique outcomes into new storylines that feel more authentic and empowering. So reauthoring is a hopeful process. It's not about denying hardship or pretending something didn't happen, but about recognising the client's values and strengths. The therapist becomes a co-author, helping the client weave a richer, more empowering story. Our role as narrative counsellors is twofold. So first, we help clients deconstruct those problem-saturated stories or those narratives that dominate and diminish their sense of agency. Secondly, we support the reconstruction of preferred stories. This involves inviting clients to describe their preferred futures and revisiting those unique outcomes that we might have uncovered in session. So these are the moments when the problem didn't dominate, and this helps to build that richer alternative narrative. It is, however, important to remember that not every exception to the problem is meaningful to the client. Once we've developed a rich description of a unique outcome, we need to ask, is this something you would like more of in your life? This question helps us ensure that the alternative story aligns with the client's values and aspirations. Alternative stories challenge those dominant deficit-based narratives. They focus on resilience, agency and cultural context. So for example, a client who says, "I'm powerless," might begin to see how they've shown strength in circumstances of adversity. So these shifts are not just semantic. They're deeply ethical and political acts of reclaiming identity and authorship. Alternative stories are not fabricated or made up. They're grounded in real experiences that have been overlooked or minimised in the person's story. This process helps the client reclaim their voice and reposition themselves in relation to their challenges. While reauthoring and creating alternative stories are closely related in narrative therapy, they serve distinct purposes and they operate at different levels of narrative transformation. While reauthoring focuses on reconstructing identity through preferred narratives, creating alternative stories emphasises challenging those dominant discourses and amplifying resilience. Both of these processes are interwoven and they're both essential to sustaining change or long-term change. So more specifically, creating alternative stories is often the first step. It challenges the dominant narratives and opens space for new possibilities. Reauthoring refers to the therapeutic process of helping clients reconstruct their life story by identifying and integrating unique outcomes, or those moments that contradict that dominant problem-saturated narrative. So this involves exploring things like values, intentions and commitments that have been overshadowed, but also reclaiming authorship over one's identity and their experiences, and integrating preferred narratives that align with the client's hopes and strengths. This process is deeply relational and it often unfolds through that rich story development where the therapist and the client collaborate and co-create a more empowering narrative that reflects the client's lived experience and their aspirations. Once a client identifies their alternative story, we as therapists help them to connect past successes with future possibilities. So some useful questions might include, well, what new possibilities might open up for you now? How will these strategies help you manage the problem in the future? What traditional ideas might make it hard for you to change? And so on. So this is getting our clients to start thinking not about the present or the problem in their life at the moment, but what will life be now with that new story, and how can you maintain that into the future? One technique for consolidating the gains that a client makes in therapy involves a therapist writing letters to the client, which serves as a powerful tool for reauthoring. So these narrative letters help immortalise the work that's done in therapy. Narrative therapists have pioneered this development of therapeutic letter writing. So these letters provide a record of the session, and they may include an externalizing description of the problem and its influence on the client, as well as an account of the client's strengths and abilities that have been identified in a session. So these letters can be read again at different times, and the story that they're part of can be re-inspired. The letter highlights the struggle that the client has had with the problem, and it draws distinctions between the problem-saturated story and the developing new and preferred story. So they serve as reminders of what was discovered, what was witnessed and celebrated in session. But they also privilege the client's point of view and can be used to launch the next session. So as David Epstein said, they bear witness to the work of therapy and immortalise it. It's important to remember that there's no linear formulaic path to follow when engaging in counselling work. So there's no step-by-step process to take if we're going to remain person-centred as counsellors. In narrative therapy, stories may be revisited, reframed, changed, or even discarded in this less than circular or linear fashion as the collaboration between the client and the counsellor deems necessary. However, in an ideal situation, over the past few weeks, we've learned how to apply a number of these different narrative techniques. So first of all, we would collaborate with our client to come up with a mutually acceptable name for the problem. So the problem is the problem, the person is not the problem. So we give that a name. We then help the client to externalise that problem and attribute those oppressive intentions and tactics to it. So we separate the problem from the person. We map the problem and we investigate how it's been disrupting, dominating, or discouraging to the client. Next, we would invite the client to see their story from a different perspective by inquiring into alternative meanings for the events and reframing these. Then we look for those glimmers or those gold moments when the client wasn't dominated or discouraged by the problem, by searching for those unique outcomes or those exceptions to the problem. We find that historical evidence to bolster this view of the client as being competent enough to have stood up to have defeated or escaped from the problem or the dominance or the oppression of the issue. At this phase, the person's identity and their life story begin to be rewritten. Next, we would ask the client to speculate about what kind of future can they expect from this new, strong, competent person who is emerging. As the client becomes free of the problem-saturated stories of the past, he or she can then envision and plan for a less problematic future. And finally, through narrative letters, but also by creating an audience, we use other people to help perceive and support the new story and sustain change with our clients. So it's not enough to recite a counter story, the client needs to live this counter story outside of therapy. So because the person's problem initially developed in a social context, it's essential to involve that social environment in supporting the new life story that's emerged in the client, but also in the conversations with the therapist. So if you've really enjoyed narrative therapy, I encourage you to seek further training. There's training opportunities through the Dulwich Centre, but there's also many workshops and different online or in-person training that occurs. This is a really handy tool to have in your toolkit as emerging therapists, because it's a postmodern approach. It's becoming, our strength-based approaches are becoming more prevalent. So yeah, if you found this really interesting, I really encourage you to consider where you might get some further training in this. So next week we leave narrative therapy behind and we're going to turn our focus to solution-focused therapy. So this is another strength-based approach that complements the narrative practice. So we're going to look at how brief interventions and future-oriented questions can support clients in identifying solutions and building on what's already working. So until then, take care, have a great week, and we hope to see you in class.